These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands, groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, we will think through the conceptualizations of relationships, the evolution of interactions, and the practice of love for Black family stability. Africa World Now Project is next. Kahlil Gibran, writing in 1921, The Prophet, presents us with a serious meditation on love. Gibran writes, "Love gives naught but itself, and takes naught but from itself. Love possesses not, nor would it be possessed. For love is sufficient unto love." Our great ancestor Toni Morrison, writing Beloved in 1977, provides us an even more clear meditation on love. Morrison writes, "Love is, or it ain't. Then love ain't love at all." Love is a praxis, a concept and practice requires serious deliberation, specifically in the context of relationships, interactions, and Black family stability, as love is often the platform or base upon which family units are built. Most, if not all of us, have heard the sentiment in some form or another, whether personally or in proximity, someone to suggest, "I love you, but I'm not in love with you," or "I no longer love you." This frame of experiences calls for serious consideration, as this expression or individualized perspective may highlight fundamental contradictions that we often normalize as being truth. I'm not suggesting that this is a problem with us or the person who feels this way, but it does call for a deeper level of engagement. When broaching a conversation such as this, it spurs great and varying debate on the fundamental meanings of love, relationships, and family. Understandably so, because they impact every aspect of our being. Yet, any cursory study suggests that every philosophy of life, religion, and our spiritual system understand that love is defined as unconditional, as it is the root in things seen and unseen. It is the root of all life, biological, spiritual, the life of the mind, and is essential to its proliferation and evolution. As someone who studies critical consciousness formation in the context of liberation movements and how this critiques and/or expands our ideas of what it means to be human, and how this comes into conflict with social, political, and cultural structures that inhibit one to express their humaneness, it must also be suggested that love, relationships, interaction, and family stability must be included in the range of things to be understood in this process. As a result, it will be important for us, me, to interrogate the concepts that proliferate a philosophy of life that guides not only the individual but simultaneously the collective understanding of these components of life. The most important experiences we will have in our journey through this material reality are directly related to the relationships and/or interactions we create, nurture, and evolve. Thus, the primary task in our efforts to create, nurture, and evolve is rooted in balancing our individual and collective philosophies of life, a task that is really the fulcrum upon which relationship and/or interactions survive the various stressors in which they form. This brings us to today's conversation. And I would like to be clear. It is not an attempt to provide definitive answers. It is not a claim of right and wrong, promoting one perspective over another. It is an attempt to disrupt normative assumptions about one of the most important aspects of our human existence: love, relationships, interactions, and marital stability, in our case, the Black family. It is an attempt to generate another way to move towards stability as passed down from our ancestors, known and unknown, to seek guidance from the healing spirits of nature and the universe. Our program is not an attempt to intellectualize, and disregard the emotional, psychological, spiritual, physical components of love, relationships, interactions, and stability. It is an attempt to provide a platform that can help in understanding and balancing these and at times destabilizing factors, molding them into lasting connections in this world and beyond. It is an attempt to help us find forever. In this regard, we bring you a recent conversation I had with Dr. Antonius Skipper. Antonius Skipper is an assistant professor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Winston-Salem State University. He holds a Master of Arts degree in gerontology from Georgia State University and a Master of Arts degree in applied research and evaluation from LSU, where he also obtained a PhD in social work. Dr. Skipper maintains an active research agenda that explores the social, medical, and familial practices of African Americans. He qualitatively explores factors that contribute to the stability and resilience in African American families. He is widely published on issues such as religion as a source of coping and resilience for older African Americans, religiosity and health, marital stability in strong African American couples, and generative fathering for Black men. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. How are you doing?
Pretty good, man. How about yourself?
Oh, man, I'm doing great. I brought you in today, and this is pretty much a program as part of a longer attempt to have you on or get our schedules together to have you on because particularly your research. I wanted to talk about, I find your research to be fascinating. I think it's very, very important what you do in the context of the whole tradition of HBCUs, but also within the context of what we call the institution itself, a Black family. And so before we get into this kind of robust, organic conversation, I just kind of wanted you to just introduce yourself really quickly to our audience and tell just a snapshot of what you do.
Okay. Well, my name is Antonius Skipper. I'm an assistant professor of gerontology at Winston-Salem State University. In relation to my research, one of the things that I kind of noticed was when we talk about Black families, it's often in relation to instability. We often talk about, single parent households. We often talk about divorce. We often talk about deficit. Very few people are talking about the strengths of African-American families and really what Black families are doing well. And so that was kind of an area of research that I wanted to get into and look more into, because I know of some couples that have been married for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, yet their stories were lacking within the research. We were hearing so much about this deficit view in relation to Black families. And so a large part of my research has been exploring the sociocultural dynamics that kind of contribute to stability within Black families and within the Black community. I think, when we look at the Black community, a lot of that starts with the family. And if we can strengthen the family, then we can strengthen the community. Then we can strengthen the HBCUs. I mean, if you think about HBCUs, it's a familial culture anyway. And so I think that a lot of that kind of plays into my research and looking at building up this narrative of how do we strengthen our communities.
And you're making a very interesting point because this is a question that obviously people of African descent here in the United States, but also across the African world have been dealing with when you're talking about this idea of a unit or the definition of a family or a definition of relationships. And so being in this particular context here in the United States, coming through institutions of chattel slavery, institutions of Jim Crow, all of this post-industrial context, but also in the context of a pandemic right now, the conversation that we are attempting to kind of broach right now is going to be very important because we're really talking about, and you mentioned the socioeconomic or the sociopolitical factors that impact the family. Can you talk a little bit about maybe one or two of the important or what you would consider to be important are two factors that should be present in understanding or moving away from the deficit model of understanding a Black family?
I think, yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think one of the things, so you talk about this kind of historical view and this historical view in the United States in relation to slavery. And one of those things has been kind of the role of the Black male within the families, right? This very intentional tearing away of Black men from families. Even if we drift on down to the 40s, 50s, 60s, we start to see all of these different policies and put in place that were largely enforced within the Black communities about having a Black male within the home. You know, it disqualified you from certain benefits if you weren't married, and all of these different things that were kind of put in place. So I think that that definitely kind of plays a part. Also, I think when we think about the Black family, a lot of times we want to compare Black families to other families. Whenever we start this kind of comparison of anything, one thing is going to be seen in deficit. Typically, we're comparing Black to white, and Black families are always seen in deficit from the way they're painting this picture. One of the things that we definitely have to do is to start to look at things individually. Look at a family for itself. Look at a father for himself, not in comparison to someone else's father, but in and of himself. So we have to get away from this kind of deficit perspective where we're comparing things, and we have to recognize that Black families are typically impacted by socioeconomic or social cultural factors more. So when we start to talk about something such as counseling, right? It's easy to say, go to counseling and we're going to talk about your relationship issues. We're going to talk about, your communication. We're going to talk about all of these kind of interrelationship things. Well, Black families are impacted by those things outside the relationships. We need to have more of those conversations within professional counseling. Let's talk about racism and the impact on marriage. Let's talk about what's going on at work and the impact of marriage, because these things impact the Black families more than they impact other families. So I think it happens at multiple levels, and a lot of it is in so many ways top heavy, where, you know, the top is making these decisions about what is going on within Black family conversations, how we're conceptualizing Black families. And so we have to be very careful with both understanding that there are things within the family that we have to discuss, but we also have to discuss those issues without the family that impact the family, the marital dyad.
I wanted to pull on this because you made a very interesting point when you talked about the sociocultural factors, but also the comparison factors, and also the impact of other factors that have a strain on what will be considered a relationship, or what would be considered a unit, because of being historically rooted in the United States as being obviously, I always say, as a settler colony. Other folk have done that, just many work to talk about that, because we really don't understand that. What is interesting is, I want us to kind of pull on this thread, is that what we're really talking about is a competing definitions of what family is based upon an African historical, ancestral, deep genealogy. And also this more European or modern perspective of a linear type of family. Can you talk a little bit more about how those definitions, particularly with young folk, maybe in their 30s or 40s, who are attempting to kind of move in their life, or try to get married, or try to have children, or all those particular? Can you talk a little bit more about what is at the root of this deficit model and this relationship definition and this competing definitions of relationships, or what family is?
Gotcha. I think it's, and I'll say this, like, I think it's all kind of intentional, as in the way of so many things in our society, to kind of create this deficit model. Because when we look at things that we hear, and we talk about deficit, and they talk about deficit specifically in relation to Black families, and they'll talk about the divorce rate, or they'll talk about the rate of single parent households and things like that. Well, we've seen these things go on in other groups as well. And we've seen that the trend is very similar. The divorce rate in the general population and the divorce rate in Black families have always had a higher divorce rate. And it's been, it's been trending in the same exact direction as other cultures. But so often we only hear about it in relation to Black families. I mean, the divorce rate has been kind of holding steady since the 80s, so that's not really impacting families. I think our changing definition in large part right now is in relation to cohabitation. Um, and we talk about young people, you know, those that are 20, 30, 40. You know, I talk to my students all the time about, you know, whether they desire marriage or what is it that they want from marriage. And we see that this cohabitation rate is growing. Is that a bad thing? I think we kind of get into this subjectivity of all of it. We see that, you know, Black women, just like white women and women from other groups, desire to marry up. Another conversation I often have with the students is, if we desire to marry up, now let's look at the HBCU. Let's look at the ratios within HBCUs, and particularly on the campus that I'm at, is many more women than there are men. And so I think our ideas of relationships, our ideas of what it means to have these long-lasting relationships is kind of changing. We're moving away from marriage, but that doesn't mean that we don't still have the same stability. We look at fathering, you know, and I do quite a bit on fathering, and you talk about that as a different kind of relationship. Even when fathers aren't in the home, Black fathers are still very involved in the lives of their children often. That's something that we're not hearing. And so when we talk about this deficit view, I think it's all intentional to not look at these strengths of the Black family, because if I begin to speak about those things that are going right and help people to recognize that these things are strengths within your community, then those become strengths that we can build on. And that's a part of what I'm trying to do with my work, is to point out these strengths and to recognize that, hey, we've survived so much already. We can continue to build on what we have rather than simply reinforcing the narrative of deficit or dysfunction.
And I wanted to, again, this is obviously a robust conversation, and this is exactly what I wanted to do. And of course, we won't be able to get to a lot of particular things, but also I'm sure people who are listening right now are probably sitting on their seat and probably fussing or maybe saying yes or whatever. But let's dig into this, right? So let's dig into this. So let's talk about the Black male. And when we talk about the Black family, there was a lot of onus at a particular point. Of course, you have reports that come out that talk about it was the Black father who is not doing what they're supposed to do in the family. And so what I'm thinking about now is this, let's push this a little bit, is that when we're talking about the definition of a family and the definition of a relationship, if we think about indigenous or ancient understanding of gender as a principle, and then also gender as understood in a European context, what is it in the context of the family unit that how much of that, let me rephrase this, how much of that contestation of understanding the conflicts between gender based upon male and female is at the center of a lot of definitions that are rooted in the deficit model? Meaning this, a lot of times folks say, you know, well, if the man is to be in the family, and if he's not in the family, then the family's not together, blah, blah, blah. And of course, the onus is put on, men at a particular point. When we look at reports, right, we look at a historical context, is that, men were the one who actually broke the family when they left, or things like that. What about this concept of gender, this contestation? Because now it's flipped. Now you have a predominantly more robust and powerful women who are able to do what they do and all that other particular stuff. Let's talk about this concept of the conflict between Black men, Black women, and that genderized, or that gender concept as being a dichotomy or as being conflictual. And the reason why I say this, and I'll end on this, I'll kind of let you kind of unpack this, is that in a context of indigenous Africa or ancient Africa, is that gender was a balanced principle. It was a principle. It was not rooted in a biological concept or a biological understanding, meaning that everybody was able to move. The unit was able to evolve and move based upon the conditions and the time that was needed. And you're getting thrust into a context of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights era, and now in this particular post-industrial era, of course, how does that play out? What does that have to do with anything? Or can you more unpack that a
Yeah,
little.
yeah, absolutely. So I think that gender definitely kind of plays the role. Let's kind of share with this idea of marrying up, right? So I want to marry someone that is more educated than myself. When we ask women, the research on Black women says that women want to marry someone that's more educated than themselves, that makes more money than themselves. And so there's still kind of this belief of, male breadwinners, right? At least as we adopted in this culture. And then when we look at, so I actually did some research to find out what makes Black families strong, what makes Black marriages strong. And interestingly, what I saw in relation to gender was this notion of egalitarianism, right? Was that this idea that everything that she's capable of doing, I'm capable of doing, whether that's in the home or outside of the home. And for many of us, for many Black families, it's been this forced egalitarianism where, my wife may not have the privilege of sitting at home to be a housewife because of socioeconomic factors and things like that. And so I think that when we start to look at gender within marital relationships, we start to see this idea of those that do best, at least from the research that I've done, are those that kind of share the labor, those that share the child care, and those that kind of have this balance within their marriage, this understood balance within their marriage. A lot of times these balances may come in conflict in relation to financial benefit, or when the finances start to get involved and people start to have financial disagreements. Interestingly, in my study, I recognized that the women tended to manage the money. I don't know if that, it may spark a different type of conversation. But it was interesting to see how many of these men within the family had kind of relinquished their money. Hey, I give my money to my wife and she gives me what I need to survive for the week or to take care of me. But the women tended to take on this kind of money management aspect. And so I think when we start to look at gender and this, we start to reconceptualize gender as, not necessarily man and woman, not necessarily masculine and feminine, not necessarily, we start to get all of these competing definitions. Then we start to kind of lose where it is where we started, where we had this understanding of what the man is to do. We had this understanding of what the woman is to do. And even in African cultures, we understood that it took this working together to make it to work, right? That it can't just be one person that's pulling the weight and the other person has a completely different role that's unrelated to that. And so I think we definitely have to kind of pull back the layers of that to see what all of this means.
So that's basically the socio-political imposition of power into, meaning that you mentioned earlier that we're talking about factors that have impact on relationships or on marital relationships. But also, let's back up for a second. We want to be clear that when we're talking about relationships, because you mentioned cohabitation and you mentioned this idea, because the idea of marriage, people have very, very interesting. Most people say they have very interesting different ideas about being married, but tend to do linear things when it comes to marriage. What I mean is that women will say to men, or men will say to women, oh, I believe in egalitarianism, right? Or I believe in this. However, once the marriage starts to play, or once it starts to go out, I say that a lot of times Black folk play marriage. There's a pretend aspect because it's the idea of marriage that they're trying to reconceptualize based upon maybe something that they didn't get when they were younger, or something that they did get and hold on to when they're older. And so where is the role of creating a space between two people by doing two things, being individuals at the same time being collective?
That's a good point, man. That's heavy. I'm gonna let them call in and get you in trouble. So this is on you. But yeah, I do think, you bring up an interesting thing with this notion of kind of playing marriage, or this idea of what we think marriage should be, or what we think a relationship should be, rather than creating it for ourselves. And when something gets bad, run for the hills because now it's socially acceptable to run for the hills. Whereas when we look at those I mean, the difference between strong families and families that aren't strong is how they deal with issues. They all had the same exact issues. So those that ran for the hills went through the same exact things as those that stuck it out for 50 years and recognized that, you know, there's strength in this marriage and this thing is worth fighting for, kind of creating their relationship for themselves instead of giving to these social pressures of what you're supposed to do or what your friends say to do. Another interesting thing that kind of emerged from my research is what I call the bachelor mindset. And some men may get mad at me for this, but what I noticed with these couples that have been married for 30, 40, 50 years, many of the husbands had gone through a bachelor mindset while they were married. And the wives would talk about how they didn't, you know, they acted like they didn't know they were married at the time, or they were still out running around with their friends at the time. These are the same exact things that those families that dissolve go through. But in these instances, the wives talked about how they stuck through with them. You know, they were there for them, they prayed for them, whatever it is that they leaned on to get through this period. And so often the husband came back and recognized that, you know, he had to grow up and he had to change who it is that he was. I think in so many ways we have to kind of recognize that, you know, there are issues that are going to test the marriage. And these issues are going to be very unique to your marriage, but in the same way, or in your relationship, in the same way that others have gone through them. The Black community needs us to be resilient within our relationship in the same way that we are resilient with so many other things if we are to build up the Black community.
What this is leading me to, because as you was talking, I was sitting here writing down a note, and what popped into my mind, particularly because you mentioned a spirituality or religion. We'll get back to that. That's going to be obviously we want to talk about that as being a very, very important component in a relationship, and I wanted to talk about the aspect that we're kind of underlining here is emotional maturity is related to communication ability.
Yes.
And so what I'm saying is that if there's conflict that always arises simply because you have two human beings who are trying to still figure out how to be together, not only because they want to be together, but they have to be, you know, it's a constant struggle. It's a beautiful struggle, I would say. That emotional maturity becomes important in the context of communication. Again, this power dynamic comes up in relationships when communicating to deal with conflict, meaning that, you know, a lot of times men will say, you know, women do, you know, you do this, or when you're trying, even if people try to resolve conflict, they're sitting down, their language still is individualized. It's still not based upon a unit. So what ends up happening is that you end up pointing fingers and saying, well, you make me feel, or you do this or this, as opposed to starting, hey, I feel this way. Do you feel this way? What can we do? What do we do with this? But generally it goes into this. And for me, and you can unpack this a little bit, because it goes back to how does one understand themselves in a relationship or a marriage. It's very important of how they're trying to define that based upon their worldview, right? So if a person is truly egalitarian and they're trying to live that way outside of a marriage, outside of relationships, then that worldview is going to be brought into a relationship. But if if women or men are listening to their boys, women are listening to their friends, and their relationship is constantly being defined for them, that brings, now you're putting in this power dynamic, and it's a power struggle. Could you unpack that a little bit? Because what I'm basically saying is that the emotional maturity, and what I mean is I'm not talking about someone has to sit down and speak very calm. I'm saying you should be able to go from high to low and still come out with generative processes, or generative fixes, or attempts of fixes.
Right. And I think that's the key word. It's kind of attempts at fixes, right? Like we're all just trying to figure so much of this out as we kind of go through it. And I think in recognizing it starts this idea.
We are listening to a recent conversation I had with Dr. Antonia Skipper, where we are exploring factors that contribute to the stability and resilience in African American families and its interdependent components: love, relationships, and interactions. Antonia Skipper, Skip as we call him, is an assistant professor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Winston-Salem State University. He holds a Master of Arts degree in Gerontology from Georgia State University and a Master of Arts degree in Applied Research and Evaluation from LSU, where he also obtained a PhD in social work. Dr. Skipper maintains an active research agenda that explores the social, medical, and familial experiences of people of African descent in the United States. He qualitatively explores factors that contribute to the stability and resilience in African American families. He has widely published on issues such as religion as a source of coping and resilience for older Americans, religiosity and health, marital stability in strong African American couples, and generative fathering for Black men. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descended communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Continue to enjoy the program.
Go through it, and I think in recognizing it starts this idea of emotional maturity. Starts with you recognizing who it is that you are, right? So I've heard it compared that men are apples and oranges, but even going beyond that, you start to look at who is the apple within the relationship. A lot of times we have an apple within the relationship that has this very thin skin. You take an apple, you can just bite into it. You get right to the core very fast. When we talk about the communication, the apple kind of opens up easily, very thin skinned again. And then you have someone that's an orange a lot of times in a relationship that has this very thick skin. You can't just bite into an orange. You have to actually peel back the layers of the orange. So when we're communicating, I'm not just going to give you outright what it is that I want to say. You're actually going to have to work a little bit to peel back these layers and to peel back kind of this emotional hurt that I may be dealing with, or for some reason why I'm feeling like I can't necessarily open up. So when we start to talk about, emotional maturity, we really have to delve into understanding who it is that we are and understanding who it is that our partner is. And that takes a lot of time. That's not something that happens overnight. That's not something that happens from simply, falling in love in your 20s and things like that. Like, you really have to begin to understand this individual. And when I have a piece that's actually under review right now of advice from strong African American couples. One of the things that came out of that paper was the egalitarian theme, but the other theme was this communication theme, and how these couples that had made it for 30, 40, 50 years had not necessarily mastered communication, but they had reached a point in their marriage where communication didn't lead to these blowout disagreements where one person was leaving and things like that. Some may suspect that the husbands just eventually learned their place.
Yeah, gave up.
You learn when to shut up type thing. But even if that's not it, I think what is being understood here is this idea that you have to kind of spend time learning yourself. And that's so much that so many of us that don't do, right? Like, we don't know who we are outside of so often the profession. Our profession becomes so much of who we are that we don't really look into the other aspects of our life and understand who it is that I am. How is it that I communicate? How is it that someone can best communicate with me? Before we start jumping into different stages of our life, we have to understand that. I heard someone say recently that some people are getting married at the stage in their life that they're actually supposed to be transitioning through. So whether you're at this stage in your life and you meet somebody, and this is somebody that's supposed to help you get to the next level for whoever it is that you're supposed to be with, but you're just getting married at that stage before you can actually grow. And so thinking back to those things, I think it really gets into this idea of apples versus oranges, of understanding yourself, of emotional maturity, because I can guarantee you your homeboys are going to pull those strings, or your homegirls are going to pull those strings. And if you're not able to stand in your relationship and understand, why it's important for you, then you're not going to be able to move forward.
And It's interesting that you say that, because one of the things I was thinking here is that I think what is important is that what we're talking about is not, we're talking and we're kind of talking around it, but I want to make sure our listeners understand that what we're talking about is an individuality, not individualism, meaning that two people have a space that they hold, but that space is held together. What I mean is that you can learn, because you mentioned about learning, right? Learning yourself. You can learn a lot about yourself by letting yourself be taught, so to speak, quote unquote. I don't want to, and that's a catchy phrase, or I mean catchy term right now. But you can learn a lot about yourself by putting yourself in a, being free to allow this other person to do that. To look and see, because again, human beings are mirrors to each other, right? Relationships and marriages are no different. So what ends up happening is we tend to think that once you cross this particular boundary of, so, a marriage or a sacred bond or a sacred particular boundary, we tend to think that a lot of stuff just doesn't apply anymore. You should know what I think, or you should know what I'm about to say before I say it, or I shouldn't have to tell you this, or I shouldn't do this. You should be. So now the you should concept becomes important, right? But that's just not the case, because since we are always evolving individually, there should be space to also evolve together, right? And so one of the things, and I'm gonna test a theory out with you, because obviously you're the scholar in this. I want to test a theory out, and one of the things I often say, and I've been working, kind of working through this, for a particular long time, is that I've been thinking about even the concept or the discourse of relationship itself, right? Of being applied to human interaction. And so one of the things that I say, or that I hold, I say, well, relationships is not necessarily something that I want to be involved in. And this is me, James, speaking for myself. I don't want to be involved in a relationship to a person that I'm intending to spend the rest of my life with. Why? Because a relationship has boundaries, meaning that once you relate to something, that's how you relate, meaning this: if we meet and you see, oh, James likes basketball, and you're like, okay, well, James is playing basketball, I'm going to give James basketball tickets because he likes it. Suppose James evolves out of basketball. That transition point becomes very important, because now you have to say, okay, am I willing to do something more than basketball in order to be together with this person? And so what I mean by interactions is that if I'm constantly interacting in relation to the world, in relation to the universe, in relation to nature, then I should be able to bring that generative concept into a relationship to understand that every day is going to be different. So I'm going to be interacting on a level to reach a more, I guess, free space between me and that particular individual, right? And so for me, language and discourse is very important. The concepts that we use to define our experiences are very important, because a lot of times they limit, or they're not able to capture what it is that we're really trying to do. Because if we're trying to be in a marriage that goes to infinity, or that being connected forever, which generally that's how people say, right? Isn't like love to death do you part, whatever? That's infinity. I mean, that's really a basic ancient concept of infinity. I mean, I don't know. You're the scholar here. You could tell me, what do you think about that within the context of some of the work that you have done, or some of the things that you have seen? Because for me, I would say those couples that stay together for 20, 30 years, they generally have an interaction, and it's very generative. And I don't want to demean it, because now I'm disrupting how we think about being with another person.
Well, absolutely. I agree. Generative in many ways, in that, generative, in that they're passing it, to their children as well. But as you kind of point out, like, you bring up this interesting theory, and it brings up some questions. So, it makes sense, because words have meaning, right? We can't take meaning away from words. So if we're talking about relationship, or we're talking about relate, and you say, hey, what if I no longer relate to that? I think, and I need someone to meet me there, right? I need someone that's willing to recognize that, hey, James doesn't like basketball anymore. James doesn't like basketball today, but he may like basketball again tomorrow. And then my question to you, because it's always, as you say, we have to exist as individuals within this collective space, right? You still have to be who it is that you are, but you're working together towards a common goal. Then my question begins, like, James, are you willing to, find out who your partner is every single day? And it may be multiple times a day, because you may wake up with somebody and go to bed with somebody at night.
Somebody completely different, right?
Completely different person, right? And so I think it kind of speaks to our commitment, not only to the relationship, but to that person and to ourselves. Are we really willing to dive within ourselves and say, hey, I'm willing to learn this person every minute of the day, and I'm willing to be who it is that this person needs me to be? You said that we're going to talk about religiosity and things like that in a moment, but I remember someone referring to biblical text, and this was a couple that I was interviewing. And in the interview, she said, I'm willing to be the Eve that my Adam needs at every moment of the day. And so it kind of gets to this, what you're referencing, and thinking about a relationship is more than just, hey, I'm with this person, I have her now, or I have him now, and then moving forward from there. But it starts to kind of tap into, are you willing to really learn this person at every moment of the day, and understand that who you go to bed with at night is going to be something, or maybe somebody completely different than you woke up with in the morning?
No, and so that's the reason why I was saying that. That's the reason why your worldview becomes important. So the worldview that you hold, the principles that you hold yourself accountable for when nobody's looking, should be the same principles that you hold yourself accountable for when everybody's looking, including your relationship or your marriage or whatever you're defining that to be. My intention in this particular part of the conversation is really to disrupt, because what I'm saying is that we really need to figure out how we disrupt the language that we use, because words are spells. Words that you keep saying or doing, words are spells, and you keep saying certain things or doing certain things or wishing or you should or these type of things. What you're doing is creating these unseen and seen barriers that you're eventually going to come across. And then that goes back to what you said earlier. You're gonna make a choice. Either I'm gonna run away from it, or I'm gonna try to climb it, I'm gonna try to run through it, I'm gonna go over it. But again, that worldview has to be there, which goes into that commitment. Now, I'm sure, so that commitment, which is probably one of the main components that are, I guess, elephants in the room of a question: when does that commitment start? Do you start that before marriage, or do you start that after marriage? Because a lot of people say that, oh, you prove to me that you're committed to me once you do these particular things.
Right.
Discounting the 500 other things that you were doing, because they're not able to see those things, simply because the fact that you bring a very robust, you know that you're different, that some people call it moody, right? Some people may say, oh, you're moody, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But it's just a certain, idea that you know things, but you also view that person to be different, but they want to be the same. So that just creates conflict. When does that commitment start?
That's interesting, right? Because if we start thinking about commitment, and a lot of times for commitment, we get into like different love languages and what appeases a certain person. And so it may be my view that, I can, if I just speak her language long enough, right? If I, or be who it is that she needs me to be long enough, then I get her to buy in, and then the marriage suffers, or our future relationship or whatever begins to suffer, because I was just trying to get her, we've heard many times, this notion of the thrill of the chase, right? And when you no longer have that chase, then the thrill is no longer there. And so when we start to talk about, these long-term commitments, and we really start to look at being with a person for 40, 50 years or the rest of our lives, we get into, multiple conversations and recognizing that words have power, even if they aren't addressed in the relationship. So those things that you say, your partner may not respond to, but they feel them, they hear them, and those things impact that relationship. So you're only going to tell me that, you know, I'm not doing something so many times, or before I begin to evolve into this person that doesn't do it.
Right.
You've created that person.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
So yeah, I think that, you know, that definitely matters. But when we start to think about, you know, commitment and long-term commitment, it's about understanding one another, as we've already kind of touched about, like at different points throughout the day, all day long, because people change, and they change with different moments. When we look at Black families, and we look at Black men, and especially in this culture of the United States, we see that, you know, a lot of times Black men leave the home and they go out and they deal with racism, they deal with things on their job. Like they're the bottom of the ladder, the person that's beat down so much. And so when I walk into my home, I don't need to be beat down anymore. Like, I really need you to be the one person. I really need this to be the one safe space where I don't feel like I have to be told so many things and given all of these different definitions of who it is that I am. And you know, as we kind of say, you create this person. Yeah.
I wanted to add to that is that also our significant other needs that too,
Yeah.
right? So it's not just, I wanted to make sure that people understood that's what you was using that as basically an analogy. You weren't just basically saying that, you know, men were coming in, because
Oh no,
often,
no.
yeah. So I wanted to kind of unpack that a little bit, because I didn't want that to keep going and people be like, well, you know, women need that, but women need that too, right? Women
Absolutely.
need that particular, and that goes back to the egalitarianism. So then, you know, women are dealing with those particular things as well in their particular context. And so what you're saying is that, you know, there needs to be a space. And so for me, a marriage or a relationship or an interaction is a space. To me, going back to my theory, a relationship has limits. So the space to me is limiting. An interaction is infinite, meaning that it changes, it evolves, it can be. So then if she is dealing with more BS than I deal with on that day, I have to be able to absorb that, or we have to be able to absorb that. So we both have to look at the space, physical space, spiritual space, and mental space as being a peaceful place, not necessarily a place where people are going and you know, not dealing with the other person or trying to get away from the other person. But that goes back to, you know, that conflict or that maturity. And again, I'm not saying maturity in a derogatory way, but I'm just saying a level of understanding that is higher than a minimum understanding.
Right. Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. Like this notion of, you know, as you say, you know, to interact is to understand this person at different points in the day and understand that it is this safe space. And, you know, you bring up, you know, women deal with this as well. Women may even deal with it more, because they're not only, you know, being excluded for being Black in so many spaces, but also being a woman in so many spaces. And so a lot of times it takes this maturity of the partner to be able to recognize that this space that we create is really about having somewhere where we can interact, have safe interactions, have safe conversations, and really be who it is that we need this person to be on that particular day at that particular time.
And you mentioned love languages, and love languages is a very sticky topic. Again, I mean, we probably should have been able to open the phones of this conversation, but love language is a very that seems to be a catchphrase that women and men. I mean, it's not just women and men. And then when I say men, it's literally we have a whole industry of relationship experts, from YouTube folk, from people who writing books and doing all types of talks. They're still using these particular concepts and ideas, which are very limiting.
Right.
You know, and so they're basically saying, well, you know, this love language thing. I often said that I speak all the love languages and languages that you don't even know, right?
At a different time.
At a different time, at a different context. So if you're looking for one particular love language on that day at that particular time, you might miss it because it's being exhibited in a different way. So, you know, this love language becomes important because also this is just code for communication, right? So communication needs to be that space. Communication could be mental space, spiritual space, physical space. Where you communicate is very important, right? So if there's things that you need to deal with, or there's things that you need to kind of iron out, maybe you need to go to a field and release that energy, because it may turn into an argument that gets into the couch, and you sit on the couch and then you don't know why you mad. You sit in that TV by yourself. You're like, man, why am I mad? Because y'all were arguing the other day when you were sitting on the couch.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, this love language, can you talk a little bit more about, like, I guess the pros and cons of the love language, or, how in your work, was there a sense that can be encapsulated into something like a love language? Or for me, that's more of an industry way of selling books and being able to kind of do certain things. Could you talk a little bit more about, this, or was it just communication on all levels, being able to go from high to low to the middle, and being able to come away from that conversation with some generative things?
So from what I've looked at, it's been communication on all levels, and being able to have these open, two-sided forms of communication where you're not just talking, but you're listening as well. And so I agree with you in that, we've started to buy into this view of a love language, and oh, my love language is buying me stuff, or oh, my love language is, her understanding what it is that I like. As you've already kind of pointed out, well, tomorrow James doesn't like basketball anymore. And so those love languages that we conceptualize as love languages begin to change. And as you kind of point out, what people want at a different time is going to change. And so I view this idea of a person having a love language as very limiting, and something that will actually hurt these interactions more than it will help them. Because I begin to think that I've got her figured out. Like, okay, I know her love language. Her love language is acts of service. All I got to do is clean up. I cook, I make the bed. I take care of the kids. I do all of these different acts of services. And then I'm wondering why our relationship, our interaction still is in turmoil. It's because she's not speaking that language anymore, or that's not what she needs at that time. I'm not understanding her particular situation. So I agree that this idea of having a love language is still very limiting. And it's like we always want to find this shortcut to stability, right? Like we're looking to these books, and we're looking to these different things to find these shortcuts. There's no pretty way to a 50-year marriage. There's no pretty way to a 50, 60-year union. And I think it's recognizing that you will consistently have these things that you have to get past, and you will consistently have to be who it is that you need to be for your partner on that particular day at that particular time in order to reach these things. And so we can't buy into these limiting ideas of, I talked about apples and oranges at first. That doesn't necessarily mean that men are apples or men are oranges or so on and so forth. That can change at any point in the day. And we actually have a apple and an orange sitting on our counter here in the kitchen as a reminder that one day at one point in time, I may be the orange, she may be the apple, and then it may completely flip because she said something that turned me into the orange. And so now I'm going to get my thick skin on, but it's a constant interaction that you have to put effort into.
And it's funny that you say that, because I'm going to be some grapes, I'm going to be some raspberries, I'm going to be watermelon. You better put all the fruit up there.
I got some seeds.
Yeah. So I want to
coconut. You ain't gonna get into anything at all.
My goodness. It's healthy for you though. That coconut, once you crack it open, it's healthy. I wanted to pull back on something that you said that was very important. And the reason why I think that I want to kind of talk slow or kind of move slow in this is because you said something that I think that is very, very important. You said that we look for shortcuts to stability. Mm-hmm. And that was a very, very important concept, because in actuality, that is generally what we're looking for. That is this idea that we got to hurry up and get somewhere in order to go somewhere. Right. So this idea that, we got to hurry up and go, but where are we going? right? Where we go, we might need to go. It's not a linear process. It's not from A to B all the time. Sometimes you might go from A to Z to go back to B just to get to E, right? Because life is messy. The things that we deal with are on a messy level, which goes back to, again, what I'm going to kind of encapsulate this conversation, because what I'm really talking about, this underlining theme that I've been kind of promoting underneath this particular conversation, and just pull it out now, is what is the center, or what should be the center of a particular relationship or a marriage. I argue that it always should be a spiritual concept, not necessarily define, religion or, whatever, but a spiritual concept. And for folk to have a quick and dirty definition of spirituality, is that it's one's understanding of their relationship to others, nature, and the universe. And they always are seeking to refine that relationship. Now, people may say, well, you mentioned that some, a lot of folk, particularly in Black communities and older Black communities, they quote Bible, or the Bible was that thing. But really, it was the principle, not necessarily the Bible, or not necessarily the religious practice, although the rituals are important, right? But those rituals have to be related to, obviously, the agreed upon, I guess, relationship, or agreed upon whatever we're going to do. Like you said, you and your wife have an apple and orange as a reminder. There are things that have to be agreed upon, certain rituals. But I would say that what you just said is actually a spiritual concept, that you always have to be reminded of, how am I in relationship or interacting with others, nature, and the universe, and always seeking to refine that. So if you're going in with a relationship and you're saying, okay, religion or religious practices may be limiting, right? The Bible may not have enough quotes in that particular day to get you out of your out of your particular state. Buddha may not have enough axioms to get you out of your particular state. However, it always should be, what is it that we relate to each other that keeps us connected? What is that particular thing? Because that's what the idea of spirituality. What is it that keeps us connected, and how do we keep refining that when things get rocky, and also what's interesting, Skip, people don't have these conversations when things are going well.
Right.
Which is also another thing. When things are going well, you still need to have these conversations, right? It's not just in the context of crisis all the time, which goes back to the deficit model, that when you're talking about being extracted from an ancestral and historical homeland, put into another particular land, and being forced to certain languages and things like that, that's a crisis. So the crisis, as you would say, the socio-political and socio-cultural, is now having a deep impact on how people are thinking about their relationships and trying to live in the future. So basically what I'm saying is, people are actually having old, antiquated ideas of what it means to be together, trying to move and live in the 21st, 22nd century.
I agree. And as you kind of say, so of course, in interviewing many of the couples that I've interviewed, 30, 40, 50 years, and a lot of it has been kind of religiosity, spirituality, and a lot of that was brought up, so much to the point that I looked at the data separate of that, right? Because there's so much out there that talks about how much this matters. I actually wanted to say, okay, well, what else matters? What else is brought up? But if we start to look at kind of what is at the center of a relationship, as you kind of say, it becomes this idea of spirituality and others' natures in nature in the universe. But I think, and I hate to bring it down and to kind of just put it within one word that can be so, I guess, subjective, but at the center of all of this is love, man. At the center of all interactions, at the center of all relationships, if we interact on the basis of love, like genuine love, not just saying it or I love you or, but genuine and really seeking to understand what love means within our relationship and what it means to actually love another person, whether that's your partner or whether that's your homeboy, like understanding love. And if we get at love, and so when we start to talk about spirituality, like I think that's the one thing that ties, we got all these religions under the sun. But when I start to look at the one thing that they kind of all have in common, and even in relation to spirituality, it is at the core of it love. And that's difficult for a lot of people to understand. That's difficult for a lot of people to take and say that, hey, this has to be the center of my relationship or my interaction. And I have to understand what that means, because again, we want that quick fix. And again, if I say that love is at the center of strong relationships, then I have to go out and actually figure out what love is at that particular point in time. And that's a lot of work. You know, it's hard enough to leave the house and go to work. But when you understand that you have to put even more work into your relationship or your interaction with your spouse, if you truly want to build these generative things, if you truly want to create a strong Black community and have children that themselves go on to be generative, then we really have to have these difficult conversations, and we really have to seek out those things which aren't going to be easily found. And that's absolutely, you know, necessary, no matter the religion or no matter where it is that you are, the contextual factors that impact your relationship.
And what I'm basically hearing you say, because a lot of times one of the things that, and again, this is me speaking, and we wanted to have like a really kind of textured conversation, is a lot of folks say that there's many definitions of love, but for me, there's love is unconditional. There's only one definition of love, and that is unconditionality. Is that means that once the love is developed and flourish, that you're creating that on your own and creating that in your relationships and other interactions that you're having even before you're with folk, right? You know, that should be the same principle that you're bringing into that, but you're also understanding that you have to actually implement it more, right? Because again, like you say, you got to wake up with this person, you got to see this person, you know what I mean? So, so what I'm saying, I mean, what we're really pushing on here is that at this particular point in our human evolution, we really have to stop looking at love in a very limited sense. And I know a lot, again, this is one of those particular points that people will probably vehemently disagree, but I mean, every religious system, every particular spiritual system, every freedom movement, whatever, as you say, every relationship is always centered on love. But what is that love if it's not defined based upon unconditionality?
Right. And as you say, this notion of unconditionality, so it goes back to something else that you brought up, was, when does commitment start? Well, commitment starts when this love or this unconditionality is there. So that may be before the marriage. That may be 10 years into the marriage. And I think that varies, because some people, you know, have to go through some things in order to get to this unconditional love. They have to experience some hardships, and those same hardships that make people run for the hills are those things that contribute to some people, you know, staying and finding this unconditional love. But I really think at the center of it all, if we peel back all of the layers, and it's not an easy answer to give, because if I go to counseling and the counselors, and, you know, I'm in the middle of turmoil, as you've already kind of touched on, when things are bad, everything is bad. I never remember the good times in the middle of a crisis. Like, it seems like this has always been bad. So if I go to a counselor and they just say, hey, you just need love. And I'm gonna be like, no, you need to tell me what to do. You need to tell me, how do I arrive at this love? What street to take to get to this love? Well, there isn't a street. There isn't this linear path. You know, there isn't a certain way that it looks, but this is where you need to be, is at this point of unconditional love in your partnership.
And we both have to be able to do that, right? So, I
Yes.
mean, there has to be, and this brings me up as we kind of wrap this up. And again, let me also say before we wrap this up, is that by no means I'm trying to limit this conversation or exclude different forms of relationships, or exclude anybody's particular preference of how they view themselves and all those other particular things, because I'm trying to get at, you know, principles as opposed to certain laws, because laws have to be broken, principles evolve. And so I'm trying to see what are the principles that can be applied across whatever type of relationship or interaction that you are attempting to evolve based upon an unconditionality of love. Which brings me to this pretty much final question for right now, is who and what are relationships for? Are they for the two people that are in it, are they for to create? Because you said, this goes back to the beginning of what we have to understand. And for me, being with someone, yes, there is obviously some mutual and collective and individual benefits for that. But what benefits the most from a healthy functioning relationship, and healthy functioning means is that we're applying principles not based upon whatever laws or whatever certain people may hold on to, that, you know, say, oh, a healthy relationship is this. What I'm saying is, what are the principles? Is there unconditional love? Is there a constant, you know, love of struggling with this person to get to another level? And you're looking, you say, you know, there's nothing like struggling with a person and looking over to your right and see them still there. There's nothing that really has a touches one. It actually, you can feel the energy of that. You struggle, and then you look over, and that person is still there, and they're looking at you. So who are relationships for? And the reason why I'm saying this is because, you know, we're really, now I'm going back to an ancient concept, or the idea of family as a unit, and as a unit of a nation, and then a nation as a collective consciousness, or a collective human evolution to more peace, to more balance, to more just. I would argue that a lot of the turmoil that is impacted, or that was created in society, was also created within the imposition of certain views of familial relationships, particularly coming out of Europe. Very linear, very conflictual, very, you know, and those things have been imposed upon the entire world through nation, through law, through, you know, forced spiritual systems with limited concepts to understand, you know, very, very long genealogies. Who are relationships for? Are they for the two people that is in it? Are they a part of a continuum, a genealogy of this conceptualization of love as being unconditional, that transmits itself through children, through their children's children, so
Yeah,
forth and so on?
yeah. As we started the interview, or we started the talk, one of the things that, you know, I initially said was, if we're going to build the Black community, not just limited to, you know, thinking of a small community, we have to begin by building the Black family. So when we think about who these relationships are for, they have to be bigger than you. And it has to be bigger than just for your children. Because if we look at the data, we see that, you know, divorce rates tend to be lowest in the first couple months during the honeymoon phase. And then we rise up, and you may have heard of the 7-year itch, right? Where if you can make it 7 years, you're good. And there's some data to support making it to 7 years. And then we begin to see this gradual decline in divorce. And then there's another huge spike in divorce. That huge spike occurs typically around the 18 to 20-year mark, because that's when the children leave home. And for those people, the relationships have been about the children. And so it has to be bigger than this partnership. It has to be bigger than the interaction between two people. It has to be bigger than only doing this for the kids, because those things are not going to sustain the Black community. Those things are not going to sustain, you know, a Black nation. And so we have to get away from, you know, you referenced this kind of European thought of this nuclear family. Hey, mom, dad, got a couple kids, dad goes to work, mom stays home, takes care of the kids, they go off, they come back home, they do their homework, everything is beautiful. That's not how we can conceptualize this notion of family or relationships. And we have to see it as being bigger than us, as recognizing that this thing is generative for several generations. And I have to love my partner so that, you know, years from now, when I'm no longer on this particular earth, I'm a spiritual ancestor, this thing continues in the Black community and within, you know, those of us that are African American or Black.
And it gives it that, basically, that continuous, that spiritual genealogy, that intellectual genealogy, that spiritual genealogy, that genealogy is feeding the generations to deal with the different conditions within which they find themselves. And that's something that we find particularly in Black movements. And when you're thinking about movements or thinking about struggles, whether it's the Black radical tradition or whatever, is that there's always this kernel of that is passed down from generation to generation, and is really rooted in this idea of an unconditional love.
Yes.
It's really rooted into a vision beyond struggle. And so as a person who really studies movements, one of the things that I I actually say all the time is that, when we're engaged in struggle against racism and anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism, racial capitalism, is that we're so caught up in the struggle, we don't have an idea what it looks like beyond. So that's the same concept that I would bring into, being with someone as well. Is that I'm going to also have an idea what it looks like beyond struggle, right? I'm going to look like what it looks like beyond conflict. We're going to be in this conflict, but we could be in two places at once. We can be who we are in relation to each other, right? So I think that becomes, a very important. I also wanted to say, those who study spirituality, those who study certain concepts, is that the data is also backed up with other particular concepts with, looking at religious studies and, the idea of 7 being a completion, or the 7 being a spiritual number itself. So the data probably has something to do with that particular long human civilizational product. There's that, those types of things become completion, or those types of things become engendered. Because of course, in psychology or the human development, 7 is when the ego or the ego of the child basically is formed. Am I correct? It's like the child is basically have an identity at 7, right? Of course, it has to be fashion, it has to be, but generally the foundational things that a person has is really planted there, and then you kind of, either evolve them or they stay what they are. That's the reason why some people act like they're still 7. When they want to run away from conflict, you fold their arms and fuss and yell and scream.
That's a good point, man. But I mean, we look at, like, you bring up a great point, because if we think about even some of the other psychological things that recognize that relationships or marriage, like we look at Erik Erikson, and marriage occurs in the 7th stage, but we get to the 8th, we get to later stages, and we see that generativity is the big thing. I think I have those right. I may have them mixed up, but I know generativity comes after the relationship. So often we're not getting at this generativity because we're so focused on our right now, or what's going on in this very moment, not, as you kind of point out, looking forward to what does this thing look like after me? What does this thing look like after us? And how do we actually sow into a community? How do we actually sow into others in the way that, we continue to guide them, even as ancestors? Like my ancestors continue to guide our marriage. And that whole notion of spirituality and recognizing that it's bigger than us. It has to be bigger than us. We can't just do this for us. Like that selfish view is going to keep us from being a collective. And actually being able to build something that is a strong relationship or a strong marriage.
And something that I just thought about as I was listening to you is that also we cannot discard the fact of violence and trauma, specifically on Black men and Black women, whether it's through social political context, whether it's through personal or interpersonal, which also, if you're building a interaction or relationship based upon unconditional love, can actually help a lot with that. But that other person has to allow that to happen.
Yes, and we can't continue to normalize that trauma, right? Like it made me think of Boys in the Hood when Trey walked in, and you remember he's swinging.
Yeah, he's swinging right in the corner, right?
Down in tears and falls down, and I think for men and women, as we kind of touched on, you have to have a home where you're able to be vulnerable. It's important for me to be able to come home, or my wife to be able to come home and be vulnerable in that safe space, right? And so when dealing with these traumas, we can't necessarily normalize them and put on this hardened skin and do these things that are going to hurt us in the long run.
Yeah. And also what ends up happening, a lot of times in that is that if that is not there, we tend to, we throw on both people oranges at that particular point. Somebody, which also goes to another concept, is that the purpose of spirituality is always a continuation of balance, as opposed to, which is another concept. I don't know if we have time to talk about it right now. Is that another theory I like to talk about a little bit as being, in a political context, but also in a cultural context, is that this contestation between equality and balance. I often argue that a functional and relationship or interaction should be based upon, obviously, everything we built upon, which also leads to what is the outcome? What are we actually trying to get to? I say if you set the objective as being a balance or trying to be balanced, I think all of these things kind of funnel into a place, right? So as opposed to saying, well, we want to get into this space that I want this person to love me and to be, my second half or blah, 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 that may never happen. But if you're saying, hey, you know what, I want to be balanced. I want to be able to be in a space that I am generating balance. I'm contributing balance. Even if it becomes unbalanced, the other person has to be able to be balanced. But there also has to be things within the context of that particular interaction or relationship. And notice I'm saying interaction or relationship because, again, I'm choosing interaction.
Right. I understand. I started to adopt that about halfway.
Yeah.
But I like that, man.
Yeah.
You make a great point in that, relationship oftentimes has boundaries because it builds this picture of what we conceptualize as a relationship. And if you relate to something, whether as opposed to interacting with it and recognizing that it is an ever-evolving situation and it is going to change and people are going to change. So I actually really like the way that, you use interaction as opposed to relationship to describe, building this union between two people or even more than two.
And I also want to make this little disclaimer here. When I'm talking about interaction, I'm not talking about some type of old school player type stuff. You interacting here, interacting there. No, I'm talking about you building an interaction, looking at your another human being that you're attempting to build a life with, despite whatever gender principle that they associate with, is that you are literally looking at them as being a active, evolving being. An active, evolving being that can be different from minute to minute, from hour to hour, from day to day. And, it's fun. It can be, but it really is based upon how you go about. So I think the disruption of language or the disruption, and that's the reason why we're having this conversation, because we kind of want to disrupt, how we are explaining our experiences. Because again, the words that we're using and the concepts and ideas that we're using, we end up saying, why I keep doing the same thing. You're trying not to be your mother or your father, but you keep doing the same thing because of the concepts and the ideas that you're using are still filtering in there because you never interrogate them.
Right. Yeah.
So before we close that, did you want to leave us with some maybe closing thoughts or something that maybe our listeners and again we're going to have this conversation again. I know this was just step one. It's going to generate a lot of stuff, a lot of applause, a lot of like fist shakings or whatever. But again, the idea of this conversation was to kind of disrupt, but also to understand that there's data, there's information, there's research, there's history, there's a lot of what we're talking about. Like, we're not making this up. Like, this conversation, this is your area that literally can reach into every area. Because what you do, and the reason why I wanted to have you on is because what you really do is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. It requires a philosophy of life that is expanded beyond just a narrow individualistic view or a disciplinary view of experiences. Did you want to leave, our listeners until we have another conversation? Of course, yes, you're at Winston-Salem State now, but of course you'll be headed in the fall down to Georgia State. Congratulations. We'll have another conversation based upon, what is coming out of this. But did you want to leave us with maybe one or two comments or something that you wanted to conclude with?
Yeah, I think, and kind of just thinking back over everything that we've discussed, one of the things, and you brought up a talk that you recently did, which you labeled, we are worth fighting for. And I think that applies here as well. And I think that so often within the Black community, within the way we talk about things, we've talked about a lot about how words have meaning. And I can't tell you what eats at me more than hearing people say things like, my baby mama, or my baby daddy, or like these types of things, right? And I think that having these words, using these words to reinforce these interactions or these relationships that we have, contribute to this deficit view. Like, we can point fingers all day and say, hey, this is where this deficit view got started. It's historical. This is how it was instilled within the Black community. This is how it was instilled within Black folks. But I think we reinforce it. We really have to be careful how we talk about these things. We really have to kind of understand what it means to say things like baby daddy or baby mom or so on and so forth, or to talk about, oh, my dad wasn't there, my dad's deadbeat, oh my, all of these things in the way that we tend to think about families. Like these words have meaning, and I think they've put, for lack of better words, these generational curses or these generative curses on us as a people. And so we have to change that language. We have to change the way that we're talking about family. We have to change the way that we're talking about interactions, relationships, unconditional love. And so I think it really has to be this kind of introspective effort where you're recognizing that this is a daily battle. This is an hourly battle. Like, we're going through this thing together. And it's for a bigger purpose. As we touched on with one of our last points, it's bigger than us. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than my wife. It's bigger than, anyone else in their partnership. Like, it has to be bigger than us if we are to truly be generative and to build on something.
So to sum it up, commitment is not a one-time decision. It is a constant process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We will be back in touch with you as we kind of move forward and kind of think through this a little bit more, because of course we're in a different period now, because I'm sure there's going to be tons of research and tons of data coming out of this quarantine, process, the people who made it and the people who didn't. It's going to be a whole bunch of data out of this. So
yeah, it is, man. You learn people in a whole new way when you with them all day.
You got
everybody working from home.
I got you. All right. Again, we'll be back in touch with you soon.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muizu Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
Feeling that brought me to you.